really a great pleasure to have you,
Thank you.
Mary Helen, with us today. I know you since the really beginning of my journey into science, and you have always been a source of inspiration, and that's your field of research, so that's great. But also you have a very innovative mindset in how we should study education, actually, because you have been trained as a school teacher, you have been working with students, and then that was your motivation to go into science. You have been trained at Harvard and then mentored by Antonio Damasio, which is someone we all acknowledge as being as well a very innovating person in the field of neuroscience. And then you know that the more we are informed from the field in the way we approach our research question, the better and the closer we will get to real life implication. And I think it's something even more valuable nowadays. We realize that we have to make teams of scientists with multiple perspectives to have something that is really meaningful for education and for the very much needed reform in education. So I haven't read anything, but you are, of course, a professor. Let's say that's the most important part. You're a professor of education, psychology, and neuroscience at the University of Southern California. But also, that's very inspiring, in 2023, you were elected to the US Academy of Education, and in 2025 to the National US Academy of Science and Art.
Yes.
And I think that's a very, very nice recognition of your courage. And let's be sharing your natural and great enthusiasm for science and education. Thank you for being here.
Solange is one of the people in the world, whenever I hear your work, I think, I wish I'd thought of that. I love your stuff. So this is such a pleasure. Thank you very much. And thank you, hi, to those online. I've put together a lot of things, not knowing who exactly would come and what you'd like to hear about. So we can sort of take you through a tour, and then we can skip ahead and hear different things, depending on what people are interested in. But I'm just going to start, especially following the introduction. Don't try to read this unless you're like a parent of a 6-year-old or an early childhood teacher, but start just reminding us of who children are, right? So if we're trying to use neuroscience and cognitive science to try to innovate in the ways that we design education systems and in the ways that we train and support teachers, we really have to rethink the way in which our own cultural ways of understanding what it means to learn are potentially not just helping us, but also very much keeping us from seeing the weaknesses in our system that I think, and this is strong language, but I think are really leading to many of the world's problems today, that our children are educated to think that someone knows the answer, that there is an answer that is correct. Someone knows it. Your job as a child is to get that, to remember it, and then to recall it on cue. And that means that you're advancing in a meritocracy of society. And that kind of individualistic recall, I think, is in fact undermining much of humans' most innovative, ethical, and creative ways of thinking and inventing societies together. And I think we're seeing the results of that in our society today with the levels of mental health problems, and also with the partisanship, the kind of strife that we have between people in the world. And so that's my little shtick for today. I have papers about that if you're interested in reading. But for now, I'll just kind of take you through a little bit of the evidence about this sort of transdisciplinary approach to studying how people make meaning of the world, how they build experience, and the neurological, the psychosocial, the cultural, the physiological ways in which those processes are emerging out of the dynamics of experiencing your own self in a social world. And so just as a little example, this is a song that was written by my daughter when she was 6 for her baby brother, Theodore, whom she calls Teddy. And so you see her, she drew a picture of herself with her music stand and she's singing, and I won't sing for you, I'll just read, but she says, "Oh, Teddy, We love you more than the whole earth size. As the earth spins every day, we love you as much as usual, but sometimes even more as you make us proud and happy that you're you. So I have a simple question. Is this a song about this little girl's love for her baby brother? Is it a song about her budding interest in planetary science? Right? It's both of those things. And this is how young children actually learn. It's actually how adults also learn. Talk to a mathematician, talk to a neuroscientist, talk to a teacher about why they do the work they do and how they understand it. And it's deeply integrated with their experience of being connected to things, of caring about things, of being feeling like you're meaningful and purposeful in your life, right? Those subjective feelings of agency and of narrative sort of autobiographical consciousness, are fundamental to the ways in which we make meaning, to the ways in which we use our learning, and are fundamental to the ways in which our feelings of thinking, I would say, the emotional, subjective experience of thinking is connecting the things we learn to the developmental implications of that learning opportunity. So the question for education, I would argue, but it's not my next slide, so I won't. The question for education that I would argue is, what does it feel like to think here? Because I would argue that the data suggest, not just ours, but many people's now, when you interpret it this way, when you look at it this way, that the subjective feeling of coming to grapple with ideas is deeply powerfully organizing, not simply of knowledge, but also of the self. And our data would suggest even of the brain. And also Solange has data in this vein also, right? So that really suggests that we need to rethink the kinds of metrics that we organize our education system around. Because I would say that the learning outcomes, the things that are finally learned by the end, are actually not the end. They're not the purpose of education. They are the means of education. They're the reason why and the way how to develop yourself. And that's the ultimate aim of education. So when we stop at what has been learned, you basically are you're looking at what the horse has in its cart, but you're forgetting to think about what kind of horse is this horse growing into, and is it scared, is it courageux, what is it doing, right? And I think some of Solange's work also really points to that, the work that we did together, especially I talk. So before I go any further, I'm just going to show a little clip of a television show that's a scientific show that we were featured in a few years ago in the United States, just because it gives a sort of intuitive sense of how we do the work. I know all of you are probably very familiar with fMRI and the ways in which fMRI is used and what it looks like. But the idea here is that we really sit with one young person at a time, and we spend an entire day getting to know them in interviews, in questions, and talking to them, not just about what they have seen in their life, but how they understand it, what their ideas are to make it better, who they want to be someday. And then we also sit with them while they talk through their reactions to 40 true stories about real teenagers from all over the world. And then we just ask them, how does this person's story make you feel? And that video, that interview is videotaped and transcribed, and then we can analyze their behavior, their facial expressions, their words, the cadence of their words, their eye gaze behavior, their prosody, many things about the video. And then they move into the MRI scanner and they watch the video again, and then they get a long gray screen and they're just asked to think about it, and then to tell us in real time, to push buttons to say how strongly emotionally engaged they are. And how much they really think it's very important what they're thinking about. They really care about it. And then they come back out of the scanner and we talk to them about it. So it's those kinds of paradigms that we're using to now try to figure out about the brain development. So I'll just give you a small sense.
Hey, welcome. Thank you for coming. Mary Helen,
You have
nice to meet you.
Since her days as a teacher, University of Southern California neuroscientist Mary Helen Immordino-Yang has been interested in knowing how emotions factor into learning.
I quickly realized that there was very, very little known about the kind of stuff that we really care about in education, like how people become inspired. How do we become interested in things? How do we build curiosity? And how can we support that process?
In trying to identify which parts of the brain are involved in the deepest and most meaningful learning, Immordino-Yang works with teens from troubled neighborhoods.
We're going to be watching stories. We really want to know what you think. So there's no right or wrong answers. These are kids who see a lot of crime. They see a lot of dangerous things. They see a lot of poverty. And we wanted to understand, how do they make meaning of that world around them? This first one is a story about a girl who lives in Swat, Pakistan. And the city was being taken over and basically run by a group called the Taliban. So I want you to watch her when she was 12 years old.
First, she gets them emotionally engaged in a topic by showing them videos about people struggling to overcome adversity.
I want to become a doctor.
So how does her story make you feel?
This story makes me feel upset how she wants to be a doctor and continue on with her education, but it makes her sad that knowing her journey would be very difficult.
For adolescents, these types of stories can trigger moments of deep reflection.
They come back from those kind of reflective moments with this heightened appreciation of the meaning of the story and what it applies to in their own life and what it means for the nature of the world more broadly.
And it's crazy how it's that powerful.
Whereas we've known that for a long time in education, the neural data are giving us new insights into the mechanics of that process.
Okay, so I'm going to stop here because probably you all know what that looks like, okay? Just to save time. But basically she goes in the scanner and she's watching the video and then she's telling us by pushing buttons how she feels. And then what we can do is look at patterns of correspondence that give rise statistically to expressed feelings and the ways in which those patterns of correspondence between psychophysiological data, neural data of different sorts, and expressed feelings are related systematically to the ways in which people made meaning in the interview, to the kinds of things they've witnessed and experienced in their life, to their cultural backgrounds. We've done these experiments, for example, in China, with people at Beijing Normal University and also at USC in Los Angeles. So at Beijing and Los Angeles, looking at the differences and the correspondences between body and feelings, these kinds of things. And what the data are really teaching us is that I think we're on the verge of a paradigm shift, like a Kuhnian shift in understanding the purpose of education. And basically we have thought about education, like I said before, as if we're in the center as the adults who are designing it, and the kids are going by with their learning, right? And we're watching them, and then Mars goes a little retrograde, and you have to give it some growth mindset, and it gets back in line, and it keeps going, right? And it's not that is incorrect any more than it's incorrect to think of to model the universe or the solar system with us standing in the middle. You can model it that way. It's just not very parsimonious. And there are many things that are difficult to understand and you have to correct for because you don't really know why Mars would go retrograde, right? So you have to just kind of ignore it. But when you reconceptualize a different center, then everything makes better sense. And what I would argue is that we need to reconceptualize the center of education as human development, as the way in which our experiences of thinking and learning in these places, in these times, with these people, feels to us, because I would argue that the feeling of that learning is what determines, and I know that's strong language, but I'm more and more convinced of it, the feeling of the learning is what determines how the learning changes your becoming over time, changes development, okay? So I'll just show you a little bit about the brain. Everybody here know about maybe I'll just show a little bit. So this is my little nephew just kind of showing us that what we see in adults and young people, right, is that when people are deeply engaged with what they're thinking about, they are using their own systems for consciousness, for self-representation, for autobiographical narrative, right? For being able to feel yourself real and continuing through time as a whole human being who's the same one I was yesterday and will be tomorrow, and can move through time like that as a kind of platform for understanding the world around you. So our cultural and social and personal ways of conjuring experience, and I mean that in a verb-like way, are deeply fundamental, I would argue, to the way in which we observe the world, to the way in which we construct narratives and meaning inside our own selves and in cultural spaces. And that's why engaging this kind of deeply meaningful, powerful feeling thinking is dispositionally really important to shape the brain over time. And that's what our data are suggesting. We're now replicating these studies, but I'll show you. So just a very quick tour through some of the main findings in the brain. This was the original study that I did with for my postdoc with Antonio and Hannah Damasio, where we asked adults to do this task. Basically, I interviewed them, I talked to them about how they felt, then I put them in the scanner, then they told us in real time how emotional they were, and some stories were meant to be very, very powerful and some less, so that we would see variation. And so what you're going to see here is just a simple contrast first between times when people said they're deeply emotionally engaged with what they're thinking about, and when they said, it's not that, I'm kind of done thinking about it, it's fine, he looks like his mother, that's nice, okay, next, right? And then we look at the difference. And so what we find is that, and this is some language I use with teachers, but the basic systems of the brain stem that are important for consciousness as compared to coma, for basic self-awareness, basic agency, even like basic experiments where people are in the scanner and they have to move their finger when they want to, right? That kind of very fundamental agency are deeply activated systematically when people say they're really thinking in motivated ways about what they're thinking about. So just very quickly, but if anybody wants me to stop on any of this, I'm happy to, but I'm going to assume you know much about it. But we have things like the medulla, right above the spinal cord. If you get damage in here, we can't even keep you alive on life support, right? This is very fundamental, and it exists fine when you control for psychophysiological change. So it's not just the psychophysiological change in the body that's driving these things. It's actually something about the mental process and in the mesencephalon and regions that are involved in motoric control and both downward and upward conduits. And then we have bilateral anterior insula, right? Which is, these are the cortices in the brain that Wilder Penfield way back in the 1950s. Does everybody know this? Oh, okay. Or should I say? Okay. So in the 1950s, he did neurosurgery experiments on patients with intractable epilepsy, and he would basically like stimulate the part of the brain where the seizures were coming. But he also kept exquisitely good notes of where he was stimulating and what people said they experienced. And when he stimulates in the anterior part of the insula, you know what happens? People vomit, right? Or they get other kinds of gastromotoric distress, which I won't describe in polite company, right? But it's basically visceromotor cortex. And we wanted to know is when people say, I really feel it in the pit of my stomach, right? Are they actually playing out the thought process on the same systems of the brain that feel the pit of your stomach, that feel your heart beating, things like that? And now there's now hundreds of studies showing that things like morality, things like ethical judgment, things like aesthetics, like what looks beautiful to you, math equations that are very elegant for mathematicians to look at compared to ones that are correct, but very awkward and ugly. You get these involvement of these cortices for all of these kinds of tasks, right? We are deeply subjectively, emotionally engaged with thinking processes. And there's interesting data that we published in 2014 about the cross-cultural study showing also how these activity profiles are shaped by culture, how they're shaped by psychophysiology differently. So if you're interested in those things, I can talk about it or point you to the papers. Also anterior middle cingulate, which I presume you're all familiar with, but it's basically running in between here. It's a very interconnected hub of an interconnectivity that together with the insula makes something called the salience network, right? A network of regions. So the anterior middle cingulate is kind of like that, part of the brain, right? It's like, oh, watch, like pay attention to this, or I should be thinking about the bigger meaning, right? It's kind of steering your attention actively, but also, like everything in the brain has an embodied job, and it's managing psychophysiological arousal also, right? And things like pain and pleasure, very basic things like that, but also attention, what matters, what's important to me. So when we think of thinking as being cognition and emotion as being something different that kind of maybe impacts cognition or is impacted by cognition, I would argue that that is even that's the wrong place to cut up the human mind. That we simply don't have thinking that isn't also experienced in an affective or subjective way. Instead, what we have is a kind of thinking that is at once affective, cognitive, culturally situated, embodied. It's all those things. And of course, as scientists, we can carve the human up like a little Frankenstein, right? And we can study the cognitive aspects of working memory, right? Or the affective or emotional aspects of depression, right? But they're never occurring separately from the whole of the experience of the thinking, I would argue. And that by carving it this way, that's fine for science because it helps us identify particular mechanisms. But we need to remember, and this is particularly true when we think about applied things in education, that the whole coming together is what actually really matters for educational designs. Okay, just in time, great. Stop me at any time if you want to ask questions. We can always talk. But we'll keep going if not. Okay, so we also found, and now there are again hundreds and hundreds of studies showing things like this, that these regions that are together called the so-called default mode network, right? So these are regions of the brain that are deeply embedded in the middle of the head for the most part. They are extremely metabolically expensive. So these regions in here use more glucose and oxygen per unit time and size of tissue as when you're just daydreaming, as the same size piece of tissue in your thigh muscle uses when you're in the middle of a marathon, right? Extremely metabolically expensive tissue. And so Marcus Rakel and his colleagues were the original ones to describe this. And there were hypotheses that if you ask people to just lay in the scanner and think about nothing, right, you would get this sort of omnipotent sort of background state of readiness for something to happen, right? And that's the opposite of what happened. Actually, when people are quote unquote thinking about nothing in the scanner, you've got this massive activity that's very coordinated now, that has been described in much detail, although there's still much more to know, in these core regions that are the ones that the cortical regions that most closely track with consciousness, right? So during anesthesia, these are the regions of the brain back here that are most closely tracking, that are cortical and not subcortical, right? That are most closely tracking with level of anesthesia, that kind of thing. And what we found is that these regions of the brain were only involved with certain kinds of emotional meaning making, of certain kinds of responses in the interview, and not other kinds. So let's look again at Isilla. And see what she says. So she started by saying, this story makes me feel upset, as she wants to be a doctor, continue with her education, but it makes her sad, knowing her journey would be very difficult. And it's crazy how it's that powerful, right? So this is what you heard her say. So I've called the first part yellow because she's basically reacting to that story right there, right? She's saying, how does it make me feel? Well, I feel bad for her because she wants to be a doctor. It's gonna be hard to be a doctor, blah, 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 right? It's about her, which we're calling concrete or context-dependent empathic thinking. It's thinking about this context in a way that is, of course, empathic and also bounded by that situation. But then she says, it's crazy how it's that powerful, right? I think this word powerful signals that she is shifting into a different level of construal, right? So like a Lieberman and Trope kind of attention to construal level, she's leaping from this context into a context in which you are inferring a broader narrative of hidden ideas, values, beliefs, lessons, histories, possible futures that imbue the certain context with meaning, but that you can't directly see by watching the story or the context. Does that make sense? So she says, I mean, and lots of pauses, right? Because these default mode systems can be interrupted. This is the pauses we were talking about. If you interrupt somebody, then those systems go profoundly deactivated, right? So if you're in the middle of a soccer game and somebody's throwing the ball at you, that's not the time to be reflecting on like, oh, it's so great that girls can play sports. You know, you have to be out here paying attention. But then you also need time to be able to step back and reflect about the invented meaning, right? The conjured meaning that is inside the mind. And this is what I would argue, in short, we are shortchanging in education and sometimes even punishing. Okay, so I mean, it makes me think about my own journey. You get a lot of self-reference when people are thinking in this way. How I want to be, go to college, hopefully be a scientist. Even more, I guess what really hits me is how not everyone is able to get this chance to go forward with their life and get an education or do what they want to do with their life. I mean, it's not right. Right? She makes this moral judgment about what everybody can do that isn't about that girl anymore, or even about herself anymore. She says, I guess when I think more, yeah, it makes me feel upset that others live in certain parts of the world where they don't have, they don't want people to learn and they're trying to hold them back. But her story inspires me. We get a lot of that sort of heightened self-awareness of the possibility space in which you're living, to work harder so that I could prevent those things from happening, maybe. Everyone everywhere should have the chance. I mean, all human beings should be able to live free and choose their life future, right? She's gone from that girl makes me feel upset that it's going to be hard for her to everyone everywhere should. She's said something universally true that she's invented a moral judgment about that includes herself, the other girl, but also the entirety of the world. That kind of trajectory and thinking instrumentally involves, our data show, and I'll show you in a minute, a kind of toggling back and forth of the networks of the executive control, right? The ones that are managing your body in space and time, the ones that are involved in default, sort of inventing an experience that's internal to the self. And we think that they are sort of pivoting by the activity of the salience network. The guts and viscera are kind of tipping attention in the way that feels like it matters to you. So the first thing that we show, and I've put little links to the papers if you want, otherwise I can just give you a bibliography later, you can write to me, but if it's easy, right? So this is just showing that there is no relationship in the sample. This is 65 young people that we followed for 5 years, okay? There's no relationship in the sample between concrete thinking, like, oh, she makes me really sad that she's gonna have a hard time, and more abstract or transcendent, like, everyone everywhere should have a chance, right? It's not related to IQ, it's not related to gender, it's not related to ethnic group, it's not related to families' wealth or even parents' education. And what we found is that amongst these kids, the more a kid talked, and again, these things are uncorrelated, so they could be doing some of both, right? The more a kid talked in this concrete, direct, empathic way, the more they show executive control network activity. For those of you who are recognizing in the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, right? You basically get the canonical modules of the executive control. And the more they are talking transcendently, the more we're getting default mode network activity. It also correlates with their real life well-being, their friendships, things like that, in the real world. So kids who are doing more of this have better relationships on average, better acceptance of diversity amongst their friends. Kids who are doing more of this, and again, they can do both, right, are more creative and thoughtful when they're solving community problems. They do things better, like scores on the standard test of creativity, like how many ways could you use a brick, that kind of stuff. And this activity in the default mode, trial by trial, predicts long-term memory for the story 5 years later when we surprise them with a question about it. So it's like, how deeply are you thinking about these things? So this is one way to kind of conceptualize what we think is going on, and it's very consistent with the way that other neuroscientists, mainly in clinical work, are thinking about it. So it's like, what matters to me? I decide what I'm going to think about and how I attend to it based on the way I experience my own meaning in a kind of a embodied way. And that shifts attention toward either more focused, watching, doing, completing goal-directed things, or more free-form and reflective ways of thinking. And so basically, it's the shifting actively back and forth that actually predicts the brain development over time, which I'll show you. But this is just a figure from the paper to show that statistically we can trial by trial. So for each individual story, compared to that kid's average across the whole hour in the scanner of level of activity, we can tell statistically when they have done this transcendent construal, because statistically we get more default mode network activity. We get very early in the trial, in the first 4 seconds, executive control activity. It's like, pay attention, get it all in mind. And then very decreased activity in the executive control. It's like, let go of the control so that I can think about what it means internally. And this is the kind of process that we think traditional schooling is interfering with, because it's saying like, 1, 2, 3, all eyes on me, move your pencil. What are you daydreaming about? Right? You have to be able to let go of control to be able to engage in, extrapolative thinking. And all of this prediction is stronger if they say they feel very deeply emotional about what they're thinking about. The emotion is actually not interfering, it's driving the effect. Okay. So in case those are interested, this is a new area of research that comes next. I'll just plow through and then we can ask at the end, which isn't published yet. We're just preparing this for publication, but we went back and looked at the network connectivity patterns across the 20 seconds in which they're thinking about the story, and looking at the shifting of connectivity amongst those networks in real time for a particular story as it is related to the way in which that kid made meaning of the story in the interview, what they said about it in the interview, and how much they were concrete or more transcendent. Okay, so you have the dorsal and the ventral sectors of the anterior insula. You know this, but they're different. The ventral sector is more part of the traditional salience network. It is autonomic regulatory. It's involved in sort of calming and eliciting psychophysiological activity in the actual physiology of the body. Whereas the dorsal anterior insula is a more evolutionarily new cortex. It's very involved in cognitive, quote unquote, oops, I didn't do that. Okay, oops, okay. Cognitive things like language, agency, but it's also the feeling of the guts and viscera coming back. So this cortex systematically activates later when you're thinking, because it takes time for you to feel back what happened. This one is quicker because it's the actual enactment, right? And we see cultural variation in that, just as a little cue. So what we did was and these are brand new effects, so I just wrote it up there for myself to make sure I say it right, because these are new. What we show is that the more transcendent thinking overall a teenager did across the entire interview, and like you saw before, there's a normal distribution, right? The more they did overall, and every kid did it some, the more they did overall, the more quickly they show stronger connectivity between the dorsal anterior insula, so the somatosensory, like drive your attention part, and the default mode and the executive control networks of the brain. So it's as if there's an expertise effect or a practice effect. When kids are very used to looking for the bigger meaning behind something, then when they get in the scanner and see a story that they had made big meaning to before, they very quickly, in the first 2 seconds, ramp up this connectivity more strongly. Whereas by the end of the trial, every kid who thought transcendently about that story shows this connectivity, but it's a slower process and it's associated in time with the degree of transcendent thinking overall. So in other words, there's like a practice effect. Kids are readier to engage. And the work we're doing now, we're starting to look at whether that can be shaped by different ways of educating, right? Kids get readier to look for the big meaning when there's mid-meaning to be had. Right? They don't show this effect when the trial is concrete. It's just somebody, oh, it looks like his mom. That's very nice. Then they don't show this, right? So it's specific to a transcendent trial. And we also see that the ventral anterior insula, which is again the part that's more physiologically regulatory, involved in emotion induction proper in the standard literature, is more tightly coupling quickly with the salience network proper when the kid does more transcendent thinking overall. But by the end of the trial, everybody who was transcendent to that story shows that pattern. Does it make sense? So there's like a practice effect or an expertise effect where you're strengthening your ability to quickly get yourself into a mental and neurological mode that's conducive to ethical thinking. And these data are from a paper we published in 2024, which basically just shows, this is just resting state connectivity. So at the beginning of the trial, this is a 5-year longitudinal study. The kids are 14 to 18, mainly 14, 15, 16. But we have some 17 and 18 because we wanted a range. The more they talked transcendently in the original interview, the more the resting state connectivity of their brain, which is just you put them in the scanner, you let them just like relax, think about whatever they want for 9 minutes while you're taking pictures, right? Which is a very good measure of the ways that the dynamics are just habitually being activated, right? So we did that at age, the first time when they came to this, to the lab, and we did it again 2 years later. And we look at the difference between the two. So how has the kid changed themselves over time? We see no correlation with the level, but the change is strongly predicted by the controls, even controlling for IQ, socioeconomic status, everything else. It's actually not predicted by IQ at all. And then the change in the connectivity between the default node and the executive control, which are toggling with each other, the change in them, but not the level, is associated at age 19 with identity development. How much do you say, yeah, I really think a lot about the adult I want to become, and I talk to people I care about those decisions, like who I really want to be, as compared to saying things like, you know, I just go along with the crowd, I don't really know right from wrong, I do whatever everybody else thinks is good, right? Which is not good for you. And identity development predicts how much they like themselves, right? How much do you like the young adult you've become at age 21, 22, 23? Slide a little thing. I really love who I am now. I hate myself, right? A list of people in your life, all these people you might have relationships with. How satisfied are you with these relationships? I really am satisfied. I don't feel satisfied with that kind of relationship. How much do you love what you're doing with your life, work or school? It's what you always hope for yourself and you're doing really well. These very basic indicators are strongly predicted along this chain, but you cannot jump past any of the developmental components. It's like a cascade. If you just predict from here directly, you can't. They have to grow themselves over time. We think of it like exercise. You can love sports, but if you don't exercise, you're not going to get stronger, which makes you healthier, right? You can think about it like that. Okay. Transcendent thinking also predicts 2-year changes in the DTI data. This is very stringently thresholded. IQ does not predict any of this. It's bilateral. And it also appears to be protective against exposure to criminality and violence in the world. So we ask the kids, what have you seen in the world that you think is dangerous or scary or antisocial, right? And they just do standardized forms and fill in that. And then we sit with them afterward and we say, oh, why do you think that happened like that? Why do you think that you see drug deals going on? Or you think that guy got arrested? Or how do you think the police person felt or the child, right? And look at the way in which they make sense of it. And what we find first is that you think of these kids as so big, they're 14 to 18, 16 to 20 at wave 2, right? And yet controlling for the violence they've witnessed before their first visit to the lab, right? We do see neural effects of that also in the anterior cingulate, for example, but controlling for that and controlling for the starting level of their brain structure. This is gray matter volume, right? At the beginning, the change 2 years later is predicted in all these areas by witnessing violence in that 2-year span. So the kids are very sensitive to it neurologically, even at 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 years old. But we also find that the effect is mitigated by transcendent thinking. So kids who think about the violence in ways that are more holistic, like, well, I think you have to really understand the whole person's history and why they might not feel like they're loved in their family. So they have to go find a gang to be part of. And if we think about that, then maybe we should be helping their families, not right. And that's how we make it better, right? These more systems level ways of understanding are protective to the structure of the brain over time. Again, we're just writing this up right now, but like if you just look at what is predicted in the thickness of the brain by transcendent or abstract versus IQ. IQ predicts only the medial temporal lobe, and transcendent thinking predicts basically all over the frontal lobes, medial, right? Like all over the place, even controlling one for the other, and they don't overlap. So they're really predicting very different variants in brain development. Again, that's a big shift in the way we understand what grows young people's well-being in school. It's the way they think about things, their dispositions of mind, not just what they know. Okay, so in 15 minutes, I can show you an example of what this looks like in a math student, for example. I could take you directly to work we're doing with teachers and show what's going on in their brains. Probably we can't do both. Which would you rather have? Want to go to teachers? And I'll point you to this later. Is it okay? Teachers? Okay. Yeah, so he basically says, he shows us what, I'll just do it very quickly. He basically says this is a kid in a very unusual kind of school for kids who have failed math every time. I said I was going to skip it, but I can't help it. It's so good. Right? And this school is teaching with big projects where the kids are coming. It's in the middle of New York City. This boy has never passed a math class before. He's 18 years old. And he says, right, if you just read that, math has helped me learn mathematically how to think outside the box in different strategies. I was given a problem. I needed to think in a new way. It's about how do I think, not what do I know, right? And so he did a problem called Zeno's paradox, which is basically the idea you walk halfway to the door. Do you ever make it to the door? Why or why not, right? So he's talking about his solving of that. He says, I spent 2 months working on a problem called walking to the door. It led me, like there's this idea of bringing somebody on a journey because it's process oriented through time. It led me to think about limits and the ideas of asymptotes. I had to study fractions, right? Like I needed fractions. Please tell me about fractions so that I would be able to think about this problem that I had. And through doing the problem, I got fascinated by finite and infinite. And I was able to connect it to my life, right? What I think is going on is that as kids are engaging in solving fractions, but being fascinated by big ideas, they're literally moving these neural modes back and forth. And doing so is tickling up their salience network, which feels like this is me doing math. Math feels like part of who I am. It's connected to my life. So it's very unlikely that, thinking about finite and infinite is really relevant to some kid living in the inner city who just, came from a war in Sudan. Okay, so the big picture idea is that meaningful learning, this is what you can tell teachers to think about. It changes teachers and students from emotions that are mainly about the outcomes and the results to emotions that are mainly about ideas. So you ask kids, you ask yourself, not so much what emotions are kids having here, or am I having here as the teacher, which is what we usually think about in educational psychology. Are they frustrated? Are they excited? Are they blah, blah, blah? But ask yourself instead, what are the emotions about? Are they about not just that this ball rolls down this ramp and then I finish the lab and I got it correct and wow, or is it about like, wow, you're telling me there's this hidden force in nature that's everywhere, that's all matter is pulling on itself and then it's pulling this ball down onto the huge piece of ground and it's also holding my feet down and making the moon make tides and like I can't see it, but I can measure it indirectly by rolling this ball. Wow, when the emotion is about ideas, that is the hallmark of transcendent thinking. Okay, so now we'll quickly do the teachers. So one of the things that we've done, we went around 40 teachers all over inner city Los Angeles in very low SES places with lots of kids of color, first generation immigrants, kids who are traditionally struggling in school because they don't have English language yet and all these kinds of things. And we asked the administrators in those schools, who are your superstar teachers? Who are your very best teachers that you think are just great? And the kids love them and they really learn. And can you introduce us? So 40 teachers from all over the city like agreed to participate in our experiments. We sent a team of people into their school to videotape them and to watch the class. And we're doing all kinds of analyses on what they did, what the kids did right now, and even the ways that people move in the space together in very low frequency bands, the coherence of movement, the dynamics of that coherence is related to the learning. There's like all kinds of very fundamental embodied ways that people are sort of setting themselves up to feel safe thinking about ideas together. So those studies are ongoing, but just this one I'll tell you very quickly. So we have teachers and they're being like psychophysiologically recorded, all this stuff, right? And then they also came to the lab and they did tasks in the scanner. One of the things, and they did interviews about how they understand their work, right? One of the things that we had the teachers do was we worked with each one to make a lesson for their class, an assignment that was the same, because they're from all subjects across school. If they have classes of kids, then they were eligible. So it could even be gym, physical education, math, history, science, humanities, language. It could be anything as long as they have a whole class of kids every day, right? So we went into the class, any class that they had, and they made an assignment that was of the form like, this week we've been learning about, right? It could be right triangles or the causes of World War II or, anything, okay? What is important about that? What did you learn? Well, how would you explain it to somebody? Like very open-ended questions. And then the kids did the assignment and gave it directly to us on Qualtrics, right? And then the teachers got to our lab and they saw it for the first time in the MRI scanner. And of course we shortened some and put others together to make it bigger, right? But they saw the real work of their real students and they graded it. We asked them, just give it a mark, okay? Then we also had work from students that we said, you don't know these students. We took this work off the internet. What we actually did was to write those answers to match their real students one-to-one, okay? The same level of comprehension, word use, all that. And so what we did was they do a block of their own students. This is Solange's paper, this is Mary Helen's paper, blah, blah, blah. Okay, give it a grade, give it a grade. And here are students you don't know, okay? And they grade those. And what we first showed is that they give the same grade to the two batches, right? So they're consistent, they're objective in that sense, okay? They give the same grade, but the brain activity they show to their own students is massively more. All over the same regions we've been talking about. Executive control regions, anterior cingulate, anterior insula, frontal regions, right? All over the place. They are massively more active in these social, affective, physiological, regulatory regions when they see their own students' work. And we also asked them, when they came out of the scanner, to give feedback to their real students. So here's your student Solange. What would you say to Solange or Solange's parents if you were meeting with her, right? Like, how do you think she's doing in general? Here's Mary Helen, how do you think she's doing in general? And we coded the content of that feedback. And based on the content of that feedback, we can predict the degree of difference in neural activity, the degree of increase in neural activity when they're grading their own students compared to not. Okay, so I'm going to show you some examples of what teachers said. Okay, that's predicting it. Okay. Teacher said something like, this student has been very consistently inconsistent the whole year, doesn't have the grades or the effort to keep up with their learning, just chooses not to do the work. I tried, there's been many methods, reaching out, it's a lot of like back and forth and tugging. I think she needs to work a little bit more on building up that diligence and wanting to do it. Okay. Or the teacher said, I mean, she's one of my star students. I think she's definitely like, if I were to say this is what a student should be or look like, Nancy's exactly like that. I do think she could push herself a little bit more just because I know she's capable of pushing herself academically, but I mean, she's doing great. I would just want her to keep doing what she's doing. Okay. Doing what she's doing, right? It's about here. It's about executive control. It's about completing assignments, finishing the learning goals. Yeah, Saria's really open-minded, courageous, curious thinker, breaking down really complex issues, seeing the issue from a lot of sides. So that open-mindedness as well, and I would have loved to see her share more and practice more courage and like sharing her ideas, building off of other people, and also being just more confident what she's saying because she has such amazing things to say. And so kind of practicing that muscle of courage, I think, will also build the confidence and help her collaborate with others in her thinking, right? This is what we would call developmentally oriented feedback. She's not saying to this kid, look, get your work done, or great job, you got your work done. She's saying, here's how you will grow yourself as a scholar. And she's turning the kid back to the community of people around her as a source of learning. This very inclusive way of socializing the classroom as a place for inventing thought. One more, I think he hits a place where he stops and he's like, I'm done. And I think the really hard work for him is going to be figuring out how to think of more things. I think that's like a skill, actually. It's like, how do you make yourself think of more things? You have to ask other people what they think and value what the people are saying about the thing. And that is part of the same problem where it's like valuing other people, valuing other people's time. We're going to work on that, especially now that he's in the honors class, which is like where we expect more, right? This is clearly a kid who's not doing well, but rather than saying like, you just have to do your work, right? Which he does have to do his work. This teacher is saying, look, here's, I think, the developmental issue. You don't know how to think enough things. So here's how you start. Listen to other people. And when you listen to them, then you might have something to think. And then you react to them and then you come back, right? And now look, you're thinking things and then you keep going. And now you're going to start really being a thinker, right? This kind of developmental orientation is what we think teachers really need to learn to develop in their schools. And it takes time. We're working with teachers across the country of the United States right now and also some places around the world to really learn what it would look like to do this. And there are schools that do it extremely well. I mean, this is a teacher, right? This person does it extremely well. But again, just to pick it back before I close, what this really looks like, it's you're thinking not about what you've finished, what you can do, what you got right or wrong, although those things are important, of course, but that's not mainly what you care about. What you mainly care about is the power of ideas, right? The engaging with other people and learning to value them, and then learning to think things for yourself, and then developing courage, right? Those ways of emotionally experiencing the thought processes, those are the things that are going to grow. I mean, the child, also their brain, I think, over time. And thank you to all of our support. And you can connect with us and get our papers or go to the website and get anything you're interested in. Thank you.